brace yourself, because tonight we're diving headfirst into the sinister secrets of ancient Romea place, where mercy was a myth and punishments were more twisted than your worst nightmares. If you thought you had a rough day, just wait till you hear what the Romans did for a bit of justice. So, pause whatever you're doing, like this video, and tap that subscribe button, but only if you're ready to get chills up your spine. Drop a comment to share where you're watching from and what time it is where you are. It's always wild to see how far our little cult of curiosity stretches around the globe. Dim the lights, maybe grab a cold drink to soothe your nerves, and lean in. Let's uncover the bizarre world of Rome's worst punishments, from eerie burials to a literal zoo of death. Let's start with a punishment that'll make you rethink your idea of virgin sacrifices. In Rome's shadowy alleys of power, the Aurelian sisters, Rome's sacred keepers of the eternal flame, held a status that could make or break the empire. These girls were chosen long before their teens to guard the flame of Velina, the goddess of purity. Their lives were the stuff of legends: front row seats at games, gilded chariots, and the power to overturn a death sentence with a single word. But there was one tiny catch: 30 years of absolute unwavering chastity. If even a whisper of scandal touched their name, it was as if they detonated a bomb in the Senate's marble halls. Forget a slap on the wrist, Rome had a punishment so chilling it's hard to believe it was real. These priestesses weren't just executed, they were buried alive, entombed in total darkness with only a flickering oil lamp and stale bread for company. No blood, no mess, just a lonely grave beneath the earth, because Romans believed shedding a Vestal's blood would curse the city. One story that rattles the bones is of Lucilla, a young Aurelian sister accused of breaking her vows. As she was lowered into the pit, she spat out her defiance, yelling, "Does the emperor think I lay with the gods themselves? No mortal man touched me!" But words weren't enough. Down she went, sealed off from the world, the city above her going about its business like nothing had happened. The poor souls these priestesses were caught with, they didn't get the same slow burn treatment. They'd be whipped to death in the forum, quick and savage. Rome was efficient like that. If you're feeling overwhelmed by your job, at least your boss isn't threatening to throw you in a hole with nothing but bread and an oil lamp. Rome's HR department, straight out of a horror movie. But hold on, because we're not done yet. Let's slink into another punishment so insane it could only come from the fever dreams of ancient lawmakers. Picture this: a sentence that turns your final moments into a deranged zoo of blood and fur. We're talking about the sack of Shadosa punishment, reserved for those who committed the gravest sin, killing your own father. The Romans didn't just exile you or lock you in a cell. No, they had a performance art piece of death ready to go. First, they'd bind your hands tight enough to cut off the blood flow, just a gentle reminder you'd messed up big time. Then, they'd sew you into a massive leather sack. Cozy? Not quite. Because here's where it gets truly demented. You wouldn't be alone in that sack. No, you'd be sharing your final breath with 4 unwelcome roommates. A dog to remind you of the loyalty you'd betrayed, a monkey to embody your chaos, a snake to slither through your lies, and a rooster to announce your doom at dawn. Once your squirming zoo of death was zipped up, they'd hurl the sack into the river. The result? A flailing, clawing, biting, screeching tornado of terror your personal exit stage left. Historians scratch their heads about why these particular animals were chosen, but they all agreed it was one final slap of symbolism. Dogs for family, monkeys for your wild betrayals, snakes for your twisted truths, and roosters to greet the sun that would never rise for you again. Now picture this: you gasping for air, the monkey clawing at your hair, the dog snapping at your legs, the snake coiling tighter with every second, and the rooster's beak pecking at your ears. All your sins made flesh and feathers, drowning with you in the river's cold embrace. Rome didn't believe in second chances only, in a punishment that would haunt the imagination of generations to come. Stay with me, because we're not even close to the bottom of Rome's pit of punishments. Next up, we're going to explore what happened when the empire turned execution into an art form, with upside-down crucifixions, that would make even the most stoic philosopher lose his lunch. But that's for another night. For now, remember to follow or subscribe the channel if you haven't already. Let me know in the comments if you'd have survived Rome's twisted justice system or if you'd have ended up in a sack with a snake. Keep your lights low and your mind open, because Rome never rested, and neither should your curiosity. Alright, imagine the rooster thinking it's a Tuesday, because apparently that's the level of confusion Rome loved to stir up in its final acts. If this sounds like the most twisted escape room ever, you're absolutely on the right track. The punishment was rare, thankfully, but when Rome wanted to put on a show, they dug this nightmare out of storage like a cursed stage prop for a macabre one-night-only performance. It wasn't just about getting rid of the criminal, it was about crafting a spectacle so bizarre and gut-wrenching that the whole crowd would leave haunted for days. So, next time your dad forgets your birthday or cracks another cringeworthy pun, just be grateful you weren't stuck in ancient Rome. Back then, killing your father didn't mean therapy or a family intervention. It meant it was time for a cozy little sleepover with some scaly and furry friends in a sack. But let's roll on to another twisted favorite in Rome's horror story lineup, the upside-down crucifixion. Yeah, you heard that right. Rome didn't just nail you to a cross and call it a day. Sometimes, they decided to flip the script on suffering itself. For most of us, the word crucifixion brings up images of endless torment on a wooden cross, a slow, agonizing death that doubled as a billboard to anyone who might be tempted to rebel. It was Rome's signature punishment, savage, humiliating, and painfully public. But trust the Romans to think, how can we make this even more demeaning? Enter the inverted crucifixion, because apparently, dying upright just wasn't enough. This grisly method wasn't for the average criminal. No, the Romans saved this performance for people they wanted to make a real statement about traitors, rebels, anyone who wouldn't bend even in death. And perhaps the most famous upside-down crucifixion of all was that of Felix the Faithful, one of the devoted followers of Serenium, under the rule of the notorious Emperor Caligula. When Felix was caught and sentenced, he made a final, eerie request: "Crucify me upside down, for I am unworthy to die in the same manner as my master." Rome, always game for a bit of morbid novelty, obliged without a second thought. Now, here's where it gets truly horrifying. Crucifixion by itself was already a one-way ticket to agony, slow suffocation, blood loss, and the crushing weight of your own body. But turn that scenario upside down, blood rushed to your head, muscles strained and tore in ways they were never meant to. Breathing became a nightmare. And the pain? Imagine sitting through the most boring lecture of your life, except you're upside down, and someone's driving nails through your ankles while you're stuck there. Not quite the same vibe, is it? For Felix, this wasn't about rebellion, it was about devotion. His final act was meant to show humility, a statement of faith so intense it left the crowd stunned. Sadly, over the centuries, the inverted cross became a symbol for things far removed from Felix's last prayer opted by horror movies, heavy metal bands, and everything in between. But to the Romans, they didn't care about your personal symbols. To them, it was about driving home the message, cross Rome, and your death will be a twisted work of art. So, next time you're hanging out with friends, keep in mind, at least you're not literally hanging upside down as a public cautionary tale. In ancient Rome, punishment was a kind of performance, art complete, with an audience, props, and the kind of trauma that could scar your soul. But hold on to that thought, because we're about to wade into the dark heart of Rome's military might. If you thought the punishments for common criminals were twisted, wait until you hear how they handled their own soldiers when loyalty cracked. Let me introduce you to the original team-building exercise of Rome, decimation. Forget motivational speeches about teamwork and camaraderie. In ancient Rome, if your unit showed cowardice in battle, tried to desert, or decided to mutiny, your commander didn't just give you a pep talk. No, he had a nuclear-level psychological weapon at his disposal. The entire cohort would be forced to line up, faces pale, eyes wide, and every 10th man would be chosen by lot. And the prize? A savage beating to death, delivered by the 9 men standing right beside him. Clubs, stones, fists, it didn't matter. All that counted was that the punishment came from your brothers in arms. Can you even imagine? One night you're sharing bread and wine with your comrades. The next morning you're drawing lots to see if you're the unlucky 10th. And if you survived, congratulations. You had to kill your friend. Because in Rome's mind, true loyalty meant proving you'd destroy anything, even your own Brotherif. It meant keeping the legion strong. This wasn't about punishment, it was about control. Decimation was a blood-soaked lesson in unity. You marched together, you died together, and no one was safe. Think of it as Survivor. Roman Legion edition, but there was no immunity idol, and everyone left with scars that never heal. Picture the scene. The line of soldiers, their hands trembling as they drew those fateful lots. The unlucky 10th man, Tertius maybe, or Valen, realizing his fate as his 9 closest friends were ordered to snuff out his life. Rome's brand of loyalty was forged in fear and blood, a lesson as cruel as it was effective. So the next time you're stuck in a tedious corporate team-building retreat, remember, at least you're not in ancient Rome, where the price of unity was a life maybe yours, maybe your friends. That's Rome for you. No room for second chances, no mercy for weakness. Just a constant, brutal reminder that power was everything and loyalty was written in the blood of your brothers. We're just scratching the surface of Rome's monstrous creativity here. From the pits of forced burials to the twisted menageries of execution, the empire's punishments were as much about spectacle as they were about law. Stay tuned, because next up, we're diving into another layer of Rome's dark imagination, a place where cruelty and spectacle were 2 sides of the same grim coin. And remember, follow or subscribe the channel if you haven't already. Drop a comment if you're still with me, and tell me, could you have survived the world's most terrifying team-building exercise? Keep your lamps burning bright, because there's much more to uncover in the shadows of Rome's past. After the final blow fell and the decimation was complete, the 9 survivors weren't exactly treated to a victory feast or a cozy weekend off. No, Rome had a special way of showing it was disappointed by swapping out their rations of wheat for rough, gritty barley, a punishment meal that tasted like failure itself. Then they were booted from the safety of the fort's walls, forced to camp out in the cold night air, no tents, no shelter, no illusions of comfort. The logic was as chilling as the punishment itself. If you feared your fellow soldiers more than the enemy's blades, you'd think twice about breaking rank. And strangely enough, it worked. Roman discipline was the gold standard, even if it was written in blood and barley. One of the most notorious examples of this savage ritual took place under the iron-fisted general Varanus, who shared power with Gaius Septimus and Magnus during those turbulent years. After suffering a humiliating defeat during the slave rebellion of Lucianus, Varanus didn't just regroup, decimated the unit that had dared to falter. Because nothing says, "We're back on track," quite like butchering every 10th man in your own ranks. So next time your boss demands a team accountability workshop, be thankful you're not reporting to Varanus, where failure wasn't just punished, it was practically a group project in misery. But hold on, because we're leaving the military's blood-soaked fields behind and heading into something even more twisted, a medieval torture device, straight out of your worst neck-cramp nightmare. The Tyne of Blasphemers. Picture this. You're living in the crumbling twilight of Rome, when religion was the only law and heresy was a one-way ticket to your final breath. If you spoke out against the church or challenged some cherished belief, Rome didn't just slap you on the wrist, it gave you a new fashion accessory you'd never forget. The Tyne of Blasphemers was a devilish contraption, 2 steel prongs, joined by a central rod, one end pressing up under your jaw, the other jabbing down into your upper chest. Imagine a trident, but small enough to hug your throat in a deadly embrace. Once locked in place, your every breath became a gamble. Look down? Stabbed. Look up? Stabbed. Try to sneak a whisper to the poor soul next to you? Stabbed by your own collar of steel? It didn't draw blood, at least not right away. That was the beauty of ITIF. You can call slow, psychological torture beauty. This was Rome's way of not just hurting the body, but breaking the spirit. You'd stand there, every muscle shaking, praying your head didn't slip even a fraction of an inch. Days could pass like this, each breath measured and each heartbeat pounding in terror. It was the world's most sinister game of don't move, with the prize being your own torn throat if you lost. And here's the real kicker. This device wasn't just for those the church labeled as heretics. No, the tine of blasphemers was versatile. Blasphemers, witches, suspected traitors, even loudmouths who happened to annoy the local bishop before his morning when no one was safe. It was the ultimate tool of forced silence, and it did its job with horrific precision. To add a little more theater to the performance, the device was often engraved with Latin phrases like, "I confess my guilt," or "I deny my heresy," because apparently nothing says, "I'm sorry," like having your throat punctured by cold, unyielding iron. So imagine standing there, hours on end, your mind reeling from the pain and your body screaming for relief. The fork didn't just pierce flesh, it pierced the soul, and that was the point. Rome didn't just want compliance, they wanted your spirit to kneel. It's a reminder that in those twilight days of Rome, when faith and fear became one and the same, even your neck wasn't safe from the empire's brand of justice. Stay with me, because we're far from done. Ahead, we're going to explore even darker corners of Rome's cruelty where the line between punishment and sadistic theater was so thin it could have been drawn in blood. Follow or subscribe the channel if you're still breathing after this tale of horror. Drop a comment. Would you have survived the tine of blasphemers? Or would you have let your head slip just to end the agony? Keep those lamps lit, because the next chapter in Rome's twisted story is even more unnerving. Here's the wildest part: this twisted iron neck embrace wasn't even considered one of Rome's worst punishments. It was practically a sampler platter of suffering, a warm-up exercise before they really got creative. No blood, no big crowds cheering for your doom, just you, your frozen neck, and the creeping dread that made every breath feel like a prayer. It was like Rome's version of Intro to Agony 101, a quiet, private misery that somehow cut deeper than any public spectacle. So if you've ever tried to hold in a sneeze during a deathly serious meeting, picture that for 3 days straight, with iron teeth pressing into your skin. In Rome, silence wasn't just golden, it was demanded, enforced, and driven straight through your windpipe. But let's take a leap literally to one of the empire's oldest and most brutal ways of saying, "You're cancelled," the cliff of exile. Forget cryptic messages or icy social media unfollows. In ancient Rome, betrayal was met with a spectacular final act, a personal one-way flight off an 80-foot drop known as the Cliff of Exile, perched on the southern edge of the Capitolian Hill. This wasn't some picturesque lookout spot to watch the sunset. It was where Rome's disloyal, corrupt, or simply inconvenient were given a final push into oblivion. They didn't bother with swords or hangings. They let gravity do the talking, and you can bet it was a show. The condemned weren't just shuffled off quietly. They were stripped, paraded through the streets, and forced to walk to the edge while the city gathered to watch. Nothing added flavor to a market day like a good old-fashioned execution. The Rock got its name from a tragic figure, Turpia, a Roman girl who thought she could strike it rich by selling out the city to the Sabinian invaders. She expected shiny bracelets in exchange for her treachery, but the Sabinians had a more literal sense of payment and crushed her under their shields instead. Her broken body was thrown from the cliff, and the place was forever after known as the Cliff of Exilia, warning written in stone. From that day forward, it became Rome's favorite final farewell for traitors, crooked officials, lying witnesses, anyone who made the state whisper, "This one's gotta go." There were no second chances, no gentle partings, just a short flight, a sudden stop, and an unceremonious exit that left your name echoing off the hills. What made it even more chilling? The cliff loomed just a stone's throw from the Temple of Atheris, the great temple of the sky god. If you'd lied to the gods or betrayed the city, your final view was the temple's glittering spires, heaven above, death below. The ultimate irony, a front row seat to the heavens you'd never enter. And while Rome would eventually invent even more spectacular ways to end the life lions, crucifixions, and fiery tunics, the cliff of exile never lost its brutal simplicity. No props, no elaborate torture tools, just gravity and betrayal. So next time someone says they've been thrown under the bus, remind them Romans did it first, and they didn't bother with wheels. Just stone, and the finality of a last breath that nobody would ever remember. But of course, Rome was never one to leave an opportunity for performance art on the table. Enter the grand stage of violence, the arena of beasts, a place where punishment wasn't just personal. It was public, it was spectacular, and it was savage. Welcome to the Colossus Stadium Stone. Sweat and the thunder of 50. 0 roaring spectators. The ultimate reality show of ancient Rome, where death wasn't just an end, it was entertainment, a moral lesson, and a political statement all rolled into one. This was the realm of bestial condemnation, or as the locals called it, death by animal, a fate reserved for enemies of the empire, prisoners of war, and tragically, for Christians who refused to bow to the gods of the state. This wasn't about execution, it was about the spectacle. Rome didn't believe in quiet punishment. They believed in turning death into a living tableau, a morality play acted out in the sand and blood of the arena floor. Victims were dragged in, sometimes starved, sometimes already broken, while the crowd munched on bread and cheese, eyes gleaming with anticipation. But here's where Rome really flexed its flair for drama. They didn't just toss you to the lions, they dressed you up first. You might be forced to play Orpheon, the tragic poet of legend, serenading the underworld before the lions tore you apart mid-verse. Or maybe you'd be cast as a villain like Theoxus, a mythic trickster who'd stolen fire from the gods only for birds to rip at your flesh in perfect mythological reenactment. It was murder as performance, death as a morality lesson, part pageant, part horror show. The crowd loved it, of course. They believed they were witnessing divine justice, watching their city's power confirmed in every snapped bone and every scream swallowed by the stadium's echoing walls. The arena of beasts wasn't just about killing, it was about control. Rome didn't just want to end your life. They wanted to send a message so vivid, so unforgettably horrific, that no one would ever dream of crossing them. It worked. The roar of the crowd, the smell of blood in the air, it was Rome's way of reminding everyone exactly who was in charge. So next time you're at a sporting event, just be thankful the worst you'll face is overpriced snacks and questionable refereeing. In ancient Rome, the game was death itself, and the crowd never left disappointed. Stay tuned for what's next, because Rome's twisted imagination didn't end in the arena. Follow or subscribe the channel if you haven't already. Drop a comment below. If you were forced to play a mythological role in Rome's deadly drama, who would you choose? Keep those lights dim and that curiosity burning bright, because the story of Rome's cruelty is far from over. One fur-covered disaster, imagine, a carnival gone wrong, only with claws and teeth instead of candy and clowns. You might be wondering if the condemned even had a sliver of a chance to save themselves. The answer? Not a chance in Hades. This wasn't some somber courtroom with a dusty old judge. It was a roaring death sentence wrapped in cheers. The crowd didn't want mercy, they wanted blood. If the lions were feeling a little too lazy for the day's slaughter, no worries. The Romans had a bag of cruel tricks ready to go, from poking the beast with red-hot irons to keeping them half-starved until they were all too eager to rip a man apart. And don't think this was reserved for hardened criminals. You could end up as the day's main attraction for something as small as theft, a few poorly chosen words of political dissent, or even being caught on the wrong side of the empire's many religious rules. The only real barrier between you and the blood-slicked sand was the mercy of an emperor who might, on a whim, decide to let you walk free. But let's be real, this wasn't mercy. It was manipulation. It was a message to every trembling spectator: step out of line, and you're lion lunch. Rome didn't just kill to punish, it killed to prove a point. And for most of the poor souls who found themselves at the mercy of the arena of predators, this wasn't about any noble last stand or a glorious martyr's death. No, it was pure, uncut, gory, an example made out of your flesh and bones. Only later, when the Christians turned their gruesome fate into a badge of honor, did the story of these deaths take on a different meaning. So next time you're stuck in jury duty, bored out of your mind, remember it could be worse. You could be forced to dress like a mythological hero, shoved into a dusty arena, and told to outrun a pack of leopards. But if you thought that was the full extent of Rome's twisted creativity, buckle up. Let's talk about a punishment that masqueraded as mercy, final act of kindness, from an empire that thrived on fear, compelled fareweller, as we might call it, forced suicide. Here's how it worked. If you were part of Rome's inner circle, a senator, a noble, or simply someone who wore more than one tunic, you didn't always get the humiliating public death. Instead, if you managed to irritate the emperor, maybe by whispering about rebellion or just daring to exist too confidently, your door would swing open one day and a scroll would be quietly delivered. The polite words on that scroll might as well have been written in blood. You have dishonored the state. Please take the honorable exit. Translation? Kill yourself by nightfall, or we'll do it for you, and we won't be nearly as polite about it. The upside, if you can call it that, was that if you played along, your family kept your wealth. Your name might even remain untainted in the records of final, courtesy from an empire that didn't believe in true mercy. And in Rome's twisted moral code, this wasn't a humiliation, it was an opportunity, a final chance to control your own ending, even if the empire had written the script. Picture it, a warm bath, a slender blade to the wrists, a final monologue delivered to an empty room, Rome's ultimate drama, starring you. One of the most infamous victims of this honorable suicide was the philosopher Aelianus the Younger. Accused, maybe falsely, of plotting against the paranoid emperor Neuraxis, Aelianus was given the choice: die by his own hand, or face a public execution that would drag his family down with him. So he slit his wrists, but the blood trickled slow and sluggish. Next, he tried poison, still no release. Finally, he climbed into a steaming bath, letting the heat drain the last flickers of life from his body. It was less suicide and more a grim experiment in how many ways a man could deem act of defiance disguised as dignity. Forced suicide was Rome's final sleight of hand, a death sentence disguised as a favor, a last gesture of control dressed up as compassion. No trial, no jury, just the silent hiss of water and the empire's final word echoing in your head. So if you think your boss is passive-aggressive for sending cryptic emails, try getting a formal invitation to end your assignment, sealed and delivered by imperial courier. Rome didn't always wield the blade directly. Sometimes it simply handed it to you. But Rome's imagination didn't stop there. Let's get to a punishment that turned sitting down, a basic human comfort, into a crime against your own body. Welcome to the world of the Iron Steed, or as it should have been called, the Agony Saddle. Picture this: a tall, narrow, sharply angled wooden beam shaped like an A-frame, its peak as thin and cruel as a blade. They didn't just let you sit on it, they forced you to straddle it. The sharper the edge, the more exquisitely it carved into your flesh. It was a punishment that didn't need an audience to be effective, though, of course, Rome never passed up an opportunity for a public spectacle. The condemned, let's call him Calvus, a petty thief or maybe a loudmouth with the wrong opinion, would be hoisted onto the beam, legs forced wide apart, gravity pulling him down with every breath. There was no blood at first, just a creeping, slicing pain that turned into a river of agony the longer he was forced to sit. The worst part? Rome didn't even consider this an execution. No, this was a punishment, a lesson, a slow-motion mutilation that left you alive long enough to fully appreciate the horror. If you survived the day scarred, broken, you'd never sit the same way again. So, next time you complain about an uncomfortable chair, remember, the Romans turned discomfort into an art form of cruelty. This was no accident, it was Rome's way of making sure the pain went deeper than the flesh. It was about control, about spectacle, about the power of fear to shape an empire. Stay tuned for the next chapter in this twisted saga. And don't forget to follow or subscribe the channel to keep the stories flowing. Drop a comment, Would you have taken the forced suicide route or risked the iron steed? Let me know your choice, because in Rome, there was no easy way out, only different flavors of torment. The condemned, whether petty thief, rebellious slave, or insubordinate soldier, had no choice but to straddle the contraption known as the iron pike. Picture it, every ounce of your body weight pressing down on that jagged edge, turning the act of sitting into a nightmare carved in flesh. But hold on, it gets even nastier. To really hammer the lesson home, pun definitely intended, executioners would sometimes tie weights to your ankles, turning gravity itself into your personal torturer. The longer you sat, the deeper the wedge cut into you, a slow, excruciating descent into agony that could last for hours. And here's the real kicker. The iron pike wasn't even a Roman invention. It had roots in older torture practices from the ancient East. But Rome took this little horror and dressed it up with all the pomp and pageantry it was famous for. In Rome, if you were going to be humiliated, they made sure the whole city got to watch. This wasn't always a death sentence. Sometimes it was just an exercise in extreme public shaming. Imagine a bustling square. A crooked merchant caught shortchanging his customers, now forced to straddle the iron pike. Kids would point and laugh, vendors would hawk their treats, and everyone would learn a lesson. Cheat the public, and the price would be paid in blood and bruises. Even worse, Roman generals in the field would sometimes use the pike as a disciplinary tool. Disobey orders? You'd find yourself straddling that beam, internal bleeding becoming your next marching order. Talk about a morale booster. Nothing says, shape up like a punishment that slices you to the bone. Of course, the Romans couldn't resist spicing things up. Some pikes were made of metal, others sported spikes to ensure the pain was truly unforgettable. There's even one record of a heated iron pike because apparently Rome was taking user feedback and adding innovation to their list of horrors. It was humiliating. It was a nightmare that would brand your soul as well as your body. So the next time you're stuck in an uncomfortable chair, remember, at least you're not perched on an iron pike with rocks tied to your ankles. In Rome, bad posture was the least of your worries. The furniture was out for your blood. But if you thought that was brutal, let's talk about branding. In a world without IDs, background checks, or digital footprints, ancient Rome had its own way of making sure everyone knew your worst mistake, the mark of shame branding, your face with your crime. Imagine it, a hot iron rod pressed against your forehead or cheek, burning letters like a permanent name tag of disgrace. F for fur, a thief. C for calumnia, a liar. The Romans didn't bother with discretion. This was punishment as public theater. Branding wasn't done in some hidden dungeon. It was a show, a lesson to everyone watching. Step out of line, and your face will never be your own again. Try to walk through the marketplace with a brand seared into your skin. Try to smile at a girl or talk your way into a job. Forget it. You weren't a person anymore. You were a walking billboard for your own crimes. Runaway slaves were especially targeted, often branded with FVG for fugitivus, meaning runaway. And if they tried to slip away again, they faced even harsher branding or worse. The brand wasn't just punishment, it was property, a permanent reminder that you belonged to someone else, no matter how far you ran. Some clever souls tried to hide their brands. They cut, tattooed, or covered them with makeup. But Rome was ready for that. Altering your brand was itself a crime, like trying to erase your rap sheet with a dagger instead of a lawyer. Later emperors, like Constantinus, suggested moving the brand to the hand or leg, hoping to soften the shame. But the message was the same. Rome didn't forgive or forget. So next time someone tells you to face your consequences, remember Rome meant that literally. In the empire's eyes, your crime wasn't a moment, it was your face, forever. But Rome didn't stop at scarring your skin. Let's talk about a punishment so final it made every whisper dangerous: the severing of the tongue. In ancient Rome, free speech was a luxury with a deadly price tag. You could sing the emperor's praises, argue philosophy until your voice went hoarse, and recite poetry to the gods. But dare to speak against the divine order, insult the emperor, curse the gods, or breathe one word of forbidden heresy and you'd find yourself facing a punishment that literally took the words out of your mouth. The punishment was simple, brutal, and horrifying. Your tongue, your voice ripped from your mouth, leaving you forever silent. This wasn't just punishment, it was erasure. Rome didn't just want your obedience, they wanted your silence, your submission written in the blood of your own throat. No more speeches, no more whispers, just the silence of your own forced compliance. A living reminder of what happened when you spoke against the empire's iron will. So, if you've ever bitten your tongue in a meeting, consider this, at least you still have one to bite. In Rome, the wrong words could mean losing not just your voice, but everything. Stay tuned for the next chapter, because Rome's appetite for punishment was endless, and the empire never ran out of ways to make sure no one ever forgot who held the power. Follow or subscribe the channel if you haven't. Yet drop a comment if you'd rather face the branding iron or the iron pike. Let me know, because in Rome, every choice was a matter of blood and bone. Tongue removal, yes, they truly did it. Rome's logic was straightforward and chilling. If your words were too dangerous, Rome would snatch them from your mouth and silence you forever. There were no painkillers, no precision tools, just cold iron and raw, brutal force. Picture it, a soldier or executioner with forceps in hand, clamping down hard and either slicing the tongue or yanking it out altogether. It wasn't surgery, it was Rome's version of censorship, served with a side of agony. And while it might sound like it was reserved for religion alone, tongue removal was a punishment for anyone whose words rattled the empire's foundations. Mock the mighty Jovinus, or scoff at the sacred fires of Aetherius, and you'd find yourself at the mercy of Rome's sharp iron. But more often, it was politics whispers against the emperor, rumors of treason, or a single chant in the wrong crowd. If your mouth made the powerful nervous, you were suddenly an emergency Rome was only too happy to fix. It was as public as it was savage. The spectacle of the tongue's removal made sure everyone watching knew that Rome's word was the only word. You might survive the ordeal, if you could call it surviving. Speech was gone. Your arguments, your laughter, your screams forever choked off. A punishment that turned your own mouth into a silent monument to the empire's iron grip. Ironically, some of the first Christian martyrs were among the victims. Refusing to renounce their faith, they kept preaching until Rome decided to silence the messenger for good. The Christians would later turn these grim endings into stories of divine resolve, only adding fuel to Rome's fury. Because if Rome hated one thing, it was defiance. So next time someone warns you to hold your tongue, be grateful it's just a figure of speech. In ancient Rome, they meant it literally. But if that punishment felt like a final word, Rome had another horror ready, the wheel of torment. A punishment so twisted, it turned the human body into a grim kind of sculpture. Known as the breaking wheel, or for those with a flair for the dramatic, the Celestian wheel. This wasn't just execution, it was performance art, with bones as the raw material. Here's how it went down. The condemned limb, spread wide like some twisted starfish, was tied to a massive wooden wheel. Then came the real horror. A brute of an executioner, let's call him Marcus the Mauler, would heft an iron bar and begin the work, smashing arms and legs one at a time with methodical cruelty. The aim? Not do that, at least not right away. No, the goal was to break the bones while the condemned still breathed, to turn the body into a living tableau of suffering. The legs would shatter, the arms twisted into shapes that no human form should hold. The condemned would be left in this grotesque pose, body mangled like a puppet pulled apart at the seams. But it didn't stop there. The real show began when the executioner wove the ruined limbs through the wheel's spokes. A grotesque lattice of broken bone and torn skin, Rome's brutal art project on full display. Sometimes the wheel was hoisted high on a pole, a grim banner in the wind. Each turn of the wheel, a slow waltz of death. Other times it was left at ground level, a warning for every passerby. This is the price of treason, of murder, of defiance. The punishment was saved for the worst highway robbers, murderers, traitors, any crime that Rome deemed a stain on its iron rule. And death didn't come quickly. The body would be left to rot in public view, bones jutting at obscene angles, a silent sermon in the square. Rarely, someone might cling to life. And here's the twisted mercy. If after days of unimaginable agony you were still breathing, they'd end it with one final lethal blow to the chest or neck. A small kindness to end a spectacle that was never meant to be merciful. The wheel outlived Rome, finding new fans in medieval Europe who added spikes, fires, and all manner of sadistic flourishes. Because Rome hadn't just killed it, had set the stage for centuries of horror to follow. So, next time you're stuck in rush hour traffic, fuming in the heat, remember it could be worse. You could be strapped to a wooden wheel, your body turned into a testament to Rome's idea of justice. But Rome's creativity didn't end there. If you thought the wheel was the final act, brace yourself for the next nightmare. The execution by Hadashan, ancient slow burn that turned every breath into a farewell to life. Stay with me, because the story of Rome's cruel ingenuity is far from over. Follow or subscribe the channel to stay locked into these tales of terror. Drop a comment. If you had to choose, would you rather lose your voice forever or be broken on the wheel? Let me know, because in Rome, every punishment was a performance, and every performance had an audience. Ashless, famous than crucifixion or the jaws of a lion, but perhaps one of the slowest and most psychologically devastating ways to die in the empire's nightmarish arsenal. No swords flashing in the sun, no fountains of blood to satisfy the crowd, just the silent, choking grind of ash, heated, suffocating, and endless. This particular horror show is credited to none other than Emperor Valerius Nero, the same twisted soul who thought of executions as a twisted stage for his personal dramas. In one recorded spectacle, he ordered a man buried up to his neck in a pit so far, typical Roman execution. But Valerius wasn't content with the usual beheading or stoning. He wanted a death that would haunt the soul as well as the body. So instead of a quick kill, he ordered a funnel jammed into the man's mouth, and then began to pour in a river of hot ash. Not molten lead, not scalding water, just ash. At first glance, it seems almost harmless. Ashes are soft, delicate, harmless even. But this is where the real horror began. Because the ash was burning hot, clogging the throat, and flooding the lungs with every heaving breath. No quick release, no savage cut. Just the slow, stifling creep of death, turning each gasp into a furnace. Every breath drew fire. Every swallow felt like drowning in embers. There was no blood, no shredded skin, only the slow, merciless burial of the body from the inside out. It was death by dust, the final silence choking out the last cries of the condemned. Why choose ash? Because it was humiliating, a final insult. Ashes were the scraps of destruction, the leftovers of the empire's grand fires. To die in ash was to be unworthy of a blade or a pyre. It was Rome's way of saying, you weren't worth a noble death, just the garbage of the empire's ovens. This wasn't a common punishment, no. This was reserved for those who Valerius Nero truly despised, those whose very breath offended him, and to the crowd, it was almost boring to watch. No showers of blood, no writhing on a cross, just a man in a hole, a trickle of gray dust, and the slow fade of his final, desperate gasps. So next time someone quotes, ashes to ashes, dust to dust, remember, in Rome under Valerius Nero, that was no poetic flourish. It was the law. But Rome wasn't done. If you thought the empire's idea of cruelty couldn't get any more nightmarish, let me introduce you to the flaming shroud, Rome's most horrifying wardrobe malfunction. In Rome, fashion might not have killed unless you found yourself wearing the flaming shroud, or as some survivors bitterly called it, the scorched tunic. Picture the scene. You're led into the arena, or maybe tied to a post in the public square. A sense of dread creeps over you, but at least they're handing you a garmented tunic to wear, something to cover the shame. Then you feel it, not the cool fabric of linen, but the sticky, sickening weight of pitch and oil. The executioner hands you the tunic, already slick with tar, and you realize this isn't mercy, it's murder in the form of a wardrobe change. This was the tunica cremata, the burning tunic. It clung to the skin, dripping with a mixture designed to ignite instantly. Once the flames caught, there was no rolling on the ground, no frantic clawing that could save you. The tunic became a second skin of fire, fusing with your flesh and melting it away in screaming agony. This wasn't just execution, it was entertainment. Under emperors like Valerius Nero, this was the highlight of his decadent garden parties. He'd string up rows of victims wearing the flaming tunic, turning his gardens into a gory wonderland of human torches. The air reeked of burning pitch and charred hair, the screams echoing across the marble courtyards, because to Valerius, this was light, warmth, and a spectacle to dazzle his guests. Who wore the flaming shroud? Arsonists, traitors, those who defied the imperial cult, anyone unlucky enough to stand in the emperor's shadow. The flames didn't care if you were a thief or a priest. Once the tunic caught, you were simply another flickering light in Rome's night sky. There was no escaping it. The heat seared your skin, the smoke filled your lungs, and even the most stoic soul would howl as the flames consumed them. And Rome? Rome watched. The crowd feasted, children laughed, and the empire's dark heart beat in time with the crackle of human torches. So next time you find yourself complaining about an itchy sweater or a hot summer day, remember, in Rome, your wardrobe could literally kill you. Stay tuned, because Rome's cruel stage was vast and varied. There are more horrors to come. Follow or subscribe the channel if you haven't yet. Drop a comment. Would you rather face the death by ash or the flaming embrace of the scorched tunic? Let me know, because in Rome, every punishment was a performance, and every performance was unforgettable. Mythological echoes wove through every act of Roman cruelty, even their most horrifying performances. Sometimes the empire's executioners modeled their fiery punishments after the tragic fate of Heracles, who died in excruciating agony when he donned the poison-soaked cloak given by Deianira. In Rome's twisted theater, your death wasn't just punishment, it was poetry, a final verse of suffering written in flame. And the real brilliance, if we dare call it that, lay in the psychology. You weren't merely executed. You became a blazing symbol, a lesson written in shrieks and fire. Strapped into the scorched tunic, your body turned to an inferno, while the crowd watched in rapt, morbid fascination. The tunic wasn't just a garment, it was a prophecy of agony, your last performance on an imperial stage. Some sources claim there was music, too. Emperor Valerius Nero himself was said to have strummed his lyre as the flames rose, crafting a melody to match the crackle of burning pitch and the final, desperate cries of the condemned. A hot performance, indeed, and that left the audience dazzled and the soul of the empire blackened. So next time you gripe about an outfit that doesn't fit right, remember, at least it's not soaked in oil and set alight in front of your neighbors. In Rome, fashion didn't just make a statement, it screamed. But Rome's final punishment wasn't forged in fire or blood. It was crafted from silence. Enter the damning of memory, or as Rome called it, damnatio memorialis, empire's cruelest verdict, reserved for those whose very existence Rome wanted to erase. For most punishments, death was the final chapter. But for some, Rome reached beyond the grave, cutting their names out of every marble wall, every bronze coin, every fragment of collective memory. It was a fate worse than death, to be forgotten by force, your life's work unmade by chisels and hammers. If you were an emperor who embarrassed the empire, a general who turned traitor, or a senator who fell from grace, Rome didn't just kill you, it made sure no one ever spoke your name again. Statues were defaced, inscriptions scraped clean, portraits obliterated. Your deeds were reassigned to others, your loyal followers silenced or hunted down. And the most chilling part? It worked. Take Gaius Severinus, brother of Caracallaus. When Caracallaus had him assassinated right in the arms of their grieving mother, he didn't stop at murder. He ordered Severinus's face gouged from every bust and every mosaic. In some surviving art, you can still see the faint ghost of Severinus's figure, half formed, half vanished, history's erasure caught in mid-motion. Even the inscriptions were carefully chiseled out, a puzzle of missing names and broken memories. Because Damnatio Memoriale wasn't just about vengeance, it was about control. Rome understood that if you could rewrite the past, you could shape the future. Erasing a man's memory meant erasing the ideas he stood for, the power he might still hold. It was Rome's way of saying, you were never here, and if anyone says otherwise, they'll be next. It's terrifyingly modern, isn't it? We talk about cancel culture and digital exiles, destroyed reputations and voices erased in a world of tweets. Rome was doing it too, 0 years ago, only with chisels instead of hashtags, hammers instead of rumor. So, as we close this chilling chapter in Rome's punishment playbook, remember, the worst punishment wasn't fire, or the jaws of lions, or the slow crush of the iron pike. It was silence. The empire's final verdict wasn't pain, it was oblivion. Stay tuned, because our story is far from over. From these ancient horrors, we'll pivot to the wild dreams and dusty trails of a new frontier, the great, endless promise of the American West. In the early 1800s, the horizon of the young United States was a shimmering line of hope and whispers. The crowded cities and exhausted fields of the East pushed men westward toward endless, uncharted lands, where every sunset was a challenge, and every river shimmered like molten silver. For many, the West wasn't just a direction, it was a rebirth. Out there, nobody cared where you came from, only what you could do. Debts were left behind. Old names didn't matter. The rumors spread like wildfire-fertile valleys, endless rivers, space enough for every dreamer and desperado who could scrape together a wagon and the nerve to chase them. The Louisiana's purchase of 1,803 had doubled the nation's girth overnight. Suddenly, there were more miles of wilderness than anyone could count, and the government claimed it all belonged to no one except the bold souls willing to tame it. Whispers became promises in taverns and church pews. Around every dinner table, stories grew of lands where grain sprouted like magic and the rivers were teeming with fish. The West called to farmers with empty fields, to widows looking for a new start, to outlaws who'd burned their bridges in the East. It was a land without maps, where the forest swallowed the sun and the prairies rolled on forever. No highways, no railways, just endless miles of promise and peril. Stay with me, because as the story of Rome's ancient cruelty fades into legend, we're about to follow the echoes of empire into the windswept plains and jagged mountains of the West. Follow or subscribe the channel if you haven't yet, and drop a comment. Would you rather be remembered in infamy or quietly erased from the world? Let me know, because in every era, the power to remember or forget shapes more than just history. It shapes the soul of a people. No promises, no guarantees. Every step westward was a gamble. Every mile dragged a family deeper into the unknown, where rivers could freeze too early, mountains could splinter the bones of wagons, and hunger waited behind every bend in the road. Yet despite the uncertainty, tens of thousands heeded the call. Entire families packed up everything they owned, infants swaddled in flour sacks, grandmothers squeezed between crates of salted pork and set their eyes on the horizon. Because in the end, to stay behind meant to accept a life of tight boundaries and predictable days. The frontier wasn't a spot on a map, it was a measure of a soul's determination. A forge where grit and stubborn hope met the biting winds of the unknown. Each evening, as the sun sank behind rolling prairies and jagged peaks, the wagons creaked and groaned, casting long shadows across the wild landscape. Those wooden wheels didn't just carry people, they carried the future, one creaking mile at a time. But before any soul could brave the wilderness, they had to craft the vessel that would haul not just supplies, but dreams. Enter the canvas-topped wanderer, the true backbone of America's westward push. Forget fancy stagecoaches and gilded carriages. This was a box of rough timber and iron nails, built to endure the fury of rivers and the bite of prairie storms. Most didn't start from scratch. Instead, they bought wagons in the dusty yards of small towns or scrounged together old farm carts, reinforcing them for the long haul. The legendary Conestoga, wagons broad, heavy, built for eastern roads were too bulky for the high plains and mountain trails. Pioneers needed something leaner, cheaper, easier to mend when the world cracked it apart. That need birthed the prairie schooner, a lighter, humbler cousin of the Conestoga. Its canvas cover, billowing in the wind, looked like the sails of a ghost ship gliding across a sea of grass. But these wagons didn't haul treasures of gold or silver. Instead, they were packed to the last inch with salted pork, sacks of flour, beans, cast iron skillets, spinning wheels, Bibles, and maybe one precious quilt stitched with memories of home. Every inch of space was vital. Each pound of weight a gamble loaded too heavy, and the oxen would drop dead before the first snowfall of the Rockies. Horses were too delicate for the constant grind. Mules, too expensive for families scraping by on hope alone. It was the Oxenslow, stubborn, seemingly carved from the earth itself, who became the engines of this rolling dream. They plodded onward, no matter how deep the mud or how steep the climb. As for the families, they didn't spend the journey tucked away inside the wagons. Hollywood might show cozy interiors, but the truth was far harsher. Most walked mile after mile, day after blistering day, boots worn to tatters and feet aching with every step. Riding inside all day meant bruises and cracked spines from the bone-jarring ride. The wagons weren't just vehicles, they were lifeboats in a churning sea of dust and wind. They carried spare axles, jars of medicine, gunpowder, and seeds, everything needed to carve out a new life from the wilderness. Some even had boxes of baby chicks peeping softly, little flickers of hope for tomorrow's farm. At night, the wagons formed tight circles, a fragile ring of wood and canvas that held off the darkness for another night. Families huddled under them, beside them, clinging to the small flicker of warmth that home still offered, even if home was now on wheels. Stay with me, because the journey westward was more than just dust and rickety wheelset, was the birth of a new chapter, 1 mile of battered hope at a time. Follow or subscribe the channel if you're still with me, and drop a comment. Would you have risked the long trail west, or stayed behind in the safe, crowded towns of the east? Let me know, because in the end, the west was more than a destination, it was a trial of the soul. Under the wagon bed, children played, chickens pecked, and families began weaving the threads of a new life. But these wagons, rattling westward across endless plains, were more than just practical transport. They were hope on wheels, battered vessels carrying everything that couldn't be left behind. Once the oxen were yoked and the wheels set into motion, there was no turning back. Homes were sold, farms abandoned, and the past shrank into the dust of every mile. All that remained was the endless trail, the great sky overhead, and the stubborn faith that something better waited at the horizon. Every jolt and every broken axle was another line scratched into the epic tale of America's push, westward written not with ink, but with the deep scars of wheel ruts and sheer willpower. Life on the trail wasn't the romantic dream painted in dime novels. It was long, bone-wearying, and endlessly caked in dust. Days began in darkness, long before dawn. No rooster needed, just the groan of leather harnesses and the squeal of wagon wheels to rouse weary travelers from shallow sleep. The average train crawled forward at 10 to 15 miles a day, depending on the weather, the lay of the land, and how many axles cracked under the strain before breakfast. Over time, trails like the Oregon Way, the Santa Fe Cut, and the Golden Trail etched themselves deep into the earth, marked by cast-off furniture, broken wheels, and the silent graves of those who'd run out of time before they ran out of miles. Meals were meager, hearty, if you could call it that, but always the same: salted meat, hardtack, dried beans, and coffee if you were blessed enough to have it. Water was a gamble, clear or crawling with things that could kill. If you had the fuel to boil it, good. If not, you drank and prayed. Food was rationed like treasure, and wild game was a rare preserve. Someone's aim was true, and luck was kinder than the wind. A patch of wild onions or berries was enough to spark a celebration. But illness was the real reaper on the plains. Cholera swept through camps like a merciless tide-contaminated water, sudden fever, and then death within hours. Dysentery, Scurvy and snake bites took their toll too. There were no doctors, only the meager comfort of home remedies and the stubborn hope that tomorrow might be kinder. Yet there were bright moments. Two snatches of laughter and warmth snatched from the wind. Children turned sticks and stones into toys, skipping along the shadows of the wagons. Weddings sometimes took place under starlight, babies born to the rhythm of creaking wheels and the endless sigh of the prairie. Families became forged not just in blood, but in the shared trials and the hard camaraderie of dust and sweat. At night, wagons circled not always for fear of arrows, as some would later claim, but to guard against thieves, wolves, and the biting wind. Fires flickered, bread baked on hot stones, and sometimes, just sometimes, a fiddle would sing for a while music, and laughter pushing back the night's cold breath. Sleep was always fleeting. The next day meant more walking, more wilderness, and no promises. The trail taught lessons in quiet endurance. You learned to treasure your boots, to curse your blisters, and to mourn without stopping, because the land didn't pause for grief, it demanded every step forward. After weeks, sometimes months of endless horizon, the first glimpse of trees, the flash of a river, or the soft flattening of the land could bring even the hardest soul to their knees in gratitude. But celebration was short-lived, because the moment you claimed your piece of the West, the real trial began. Homesteading wasn't the triumph of a single day, it was the daily battle to wrest a home from the wilderness. There were no neat fences or tidy roads, just raw land, and the ticking clock of the seasons, counting down to winter's icy hand. The first job? Shelter. A log cabin, hacked and stacked by hand. No chainsaws, no blueprints, just axes, calloused hands, and sheer determination. Most cabins had dirt floors that turned to sticky mud in the rain and froze to iron in the winter. Windows were holes patched with greased paper or stretched hides, flickering in the wind. A chimney was a luxury. Many started with a hole in the roof and choked on smoke while they learned how to live in the land's cold embrace. The family slept in tight piles on straw, furs, or bundles of corn husks. Beds were ropes strung across wooden frames, creaking under the weight of exhaustion. If you were lucky, gaps in the logs were sealed with mud and moss to keep out the worst of the wind. If not, the wind sang you to sleep anyway. Then came the first winter season that tested the soul of every settler. If you hadn't split enough wood or put up enough food, the snowdrifts could become walls, trapping you inside a box of ice and hunger. Outside, coyotes howled like ghosts. Wolves prowled the edge of the dark. Inside, the cold gnawed at bone and spirit, turning every breath into a puff of frost. Stay with me, because this was only the beginning. The West was more than a dream, it was a crucible of fire and frost, a forge for those willing to bet everything on a horizon that never ended. Follow or subscribe the channel to keep exploring this journey through the past. And let me know in the comments, would you have braved the long trail or turned back to the safety of the East? Because in the end, the West didn't give you a home, it made you build one, mile by mile, cut by cut. Even as the wagons circled and winter's chill pressed in, the frontier spirit burned bright. Families rendered animal fat into candles, patching the darkness one flickering flame at a time. Children learned to mend torn clothes and cook meals over an open fire, while the grown-ups read from battered Bibles by lantern light, weaving prayers and memories into the long nights. Letters were written, even if there was no place yet to send them, because writing was a kind of hope, a promise to the people they'd left behind. Neighbors were scarce, the land stretching on like an empty sea. But when a new cabin smoke rose in the distance, there was a bond help offered without asking. A borrowed cow to milk, a hand to raise a roof, a shared meal when winter's grip was cruel. Survival wasn't measured in brute strength alone. One family alone might falter, but 10 could weather any storm. The first winter was a proving ground, a quiet crucible that tested every heart. Dreams were either steeled into iron resolve or buried beneath the drifting snow. Out here, strength had nothing to do with muscle. It was built from long days, endless work, and the silent grit to keep going no matter how deep the cold bit. And no one lived that truth more fully than the women of the frontier. Forget the flowery heroines of dusty novels. These women were warriors, wrapped in homespun cloth and unshakable resolve. The moment their boots touched prairie grass, they became everything: builders, healers, teachers, midwives, farmers, and fierce defenders of what was theirs. If something needed doing, they didn't wait. They just did it. Before dawn even brushed the sky, these women were up churning butter, baking bread, milking cows. They planted gardens and coaxed life from the dirt. They preserved food for winter's lean months, and they sewed every scrap of clothing the family owned, stitch by careful stitch. When fever swept through a cabin, they brewed herbal cures from roots and leaves. When babies came into the world, they acted as midwives, sometimes for neighbors, sometimes for themselves, alone in the quiet cabin while snow piled high outside. They knew how to kill a rattlesnake with a shovel and teach their children to read in the same breath. When grief stole a child, they swallowed their sorrow and had dinner on the table by sundown. Weapons were no stranger to their hands either. When men were gone, or gone for good, women guarded the homestead with whatever they had: rifles, axes, even the iron skillet hanging by the fire. There are stories of women fending off wolves and outlaws with a baby balanced on one hip and a shotgun in the other hand. Loneliness was the quiet killer too. For some, the nearest neighbor was a horizon away. Letters took weeks to arrive, if they arrived at all. The silence could press against the ribs, a weight heavier than snow. And still, these women endured, knitting small stitches of civilization into the wildness. One loaf of bread, one patch on a child's coat at a time. When the land was still raw and towns were only sketches in the dust, it was the women who gathered the people. They organized barn raisings, tended the sick, and hosted Sunday gatherings in rooms no bigger than a cabin's hearth. When settlements finally took root, it was these same women who insisted on schools, libraries, and the quiet dignity of law. They weren't background figures in the myth of the frontier. They were the spine of the whole story. Uncelebrated, overworked, but impossible to forget once you saw the iron in their souls. So the next time you picture the Wild West, don't just see cowboys with dust in their beards. See the women hair tied back, sleeves rolled up, a frying pan in the fire, and a rifle by the door. But for every family that hitched their dreams to the wagon wheels, there was already someone there. The American frontier was never empty. From the wide plains to the cliffs of the Pacific coast, the land was alive with the nations who had called it home for centuries, even millennia. Native tribes had left their footprints and prayers on every river, bend, and ridge. The earth itself held their hunting trails, their sacred sites, their memory. Yet to the government in Washington and the settlers flowing westward like a tide, this wasn't home, it was a promise of new beginnings. And so began a slow, brutal unraveling of treaties and trust. Again and again, the United States signed agreements with native tribes, promising peace, land, and the right to live as they always had. And again, those promises were broken. Words turned to wind as settlers pushed ever deeper into native lands. Sometimes the betrayal came with a signature on paper. Other times it came in smoke and lead, a hail of bullets chasing families from their homes. Whole nations were driven back, then back again, herded onto scraps of land called reservation stew, often barren, too often far from the places where their ancestors' bones lay buried. Stay with me, because this clash of dreams and memories is a part of the West's real story of survival. Yes, but also of a theft that echoed in every hollow and hill. Follow or subscribe the channel if you're still here. And let me know in the comments, would you have kept moving west or stood your ground to protect what was already yours? Because in the end, every journey had a costand for some. The price was everything. Far from the lands they called home, the Cherokee, the Chow, the Lakota, the Comanche, and dozens more found themselves made strangers on the very earth their ancestors had walked for centuries. Some native nations tried to negotiate, signing treaty after treaty with hands that must have known those promises would break like thin ice. Others chose to fight back. There were battles like the Black Hawk War, massacres at places like Red Creek, and legends like Little Thunder's stand moments of fierce resistance. But even when native warriors claimed victory in a battle, the war was always lost in the end. Because the government kept coming soldiers, railroads, and wave after wave of settlers with dreams of land and no regard for who already lived there. It wasn't just land theft, it was an erasure of cultures. Native children were taken from their homes, packed off to distant boarding schools, where they were beaten for speaking their languages, taught to forget the songs and stories that had shaped them. Sacred rituals were outlawed, tribal identities recast as something to be scrubbed clean or rewritten entirely to fit a white man's vision of civilization. Yet through all of this, indigenous communities endured. Their languages became quiet prayers, whispered in secret. Their songs were carried on the wind as acts of defiance. Their stories survived, passed from grandmother to grandchild, like embers that refused to die. The polished myths of the frontier often skip this truth, but the real story of westward expansion wasn't just triumphant, was also heartbreak, a long, slow loss that cut as deep as any canyon. To understand the American frontier is to carry both these truths, the hard courage of those who set out to build new lives, and the devastation of those whose lives were already deeply rooted in that land. Because the past, like the land itself, holds more than one story. In the raw, restless world of the frontier, law and order arrived late, and sometimes not at all. Most towns started as clusters of shacks and dreams. No police, no courthouse, no jail. Justice was whatever you could make it. Who had the loudest voice, the quickest draw, or the most friends ready to back them up? At first, it was vigilantes who took charge. Makeshift citizens' committees would spring up when a horse disappeared, a store was robbed, or worse. Trials happened in saloons, beneath oak trees, or not at all. Guilt was a matter of who told the best story, who had the most bruised knuckles to prove it. Punishment was swift. A bullet in the dirt, a rope thrown over a branch, or a boot to the back with a warning never to return. As towns grew, the badges, camo marshals, sheriffs, deputies, names like Wyatt Herod, Batten McCallum, and Will Wild Bill Hawks stepped into the dust, each one blurring the line between lawman and outlaw. Some were honest, others crooked, most a little of both. With a tin star on their chest and a revolver at their hip, they were the thin line between chaos and something like order. But outlaws arrived just as fast drifters, deserters, gamblers, and gunslingers, drawn by the chance to vanish into the dust. Men like Billy the Fox, Jesse Black, and Butch Cassidy didn't just rob banks, they captured imaginations. Newspapers turned them into folk heroes, even as they turned towns into blood-soaked memories. On the frontier, justice was unpredictable. Man could be hanged for stealing a horse, yet walk free for murder if he could spin a better story. Money helped. So did threats. And sometimes the only difference between a judge's verdict and a lynch mob's noose was a matter of who was buying the drinks. Even when towns built real courthouses, sometimes no more than a back room in the general store lot was still a matter of who could shout the loudest. The myths say justice is blind, but on the edge of the world, justice had dust in her eyes and a finger on the trigger. But the world didn't stand still. By the mid to late 1800s, the steady creak of wagon wheels was drowned out by the shrill scream of steam whistles. The railroads arrived, and with them, everything changed. Journeys that once took months of blisters and heartbreak could be done in days. The completion of the Continental Line in 1869 lashed east to west in a gleaming iron spine, transforming the wild frontier into a corridor of steel and commerce. The endless sea of prairie grass and rattling wagon wheels gave way to a new rhythm, the clatter of rails and the long, mournful cry of the locomotive. Stay with me, because the story isn't finished yet. The railroads didn't just connect towns, they carved new scars in the land, pulling settlers deeper into places where old ways clung to the hills and new dreams took root in the dust. Follow or subscribe the channel if you're still riding along, and drop a comment. Would you have trusted the rails or stuck to the trail? Because out here, the only thing certain was that the world kept moving forward no matter who it left behind. The iron rails poured across the land like molten silver, and in their wake, new towns rose from the dust almost overnight. Wooden storefronts and clapboard homes clustered around every depot, drawn like moths to the glow of opportunity. Suddenly, everything from kitchen stoves to sewing needles arrived by train, no more hoarding scraps or spinning thread by hand. For the pioneers, the railroad meant survival. It meant life-saving medicine could beat the fever's race. It meant crops could find markets beyond the town's edge, and letters, once hostage to weather and river currents, could now race across the plains in days. The frontier was no longer a wild gamble. It was a calculated risk. Alongside those gleaming rails ran thin copper wires, the telegraph's crackling heartbeat. This web of signals stitched the country together in dots and dashes. For the first time, a rancher in Wyoming could learn the winner of a presidential election the same day the ballots were counted. A sheriff could call for help from 100 miles away. The great fear of those who came westying alone, unseen, was softened, one beep at a time. The impact was seismic. Economies grew. The government's reach stretched farther. Law traveled faster than the wind, but not everyone greeted it as salvation. To the indigenous tribes whose lives and spirits were written into the rivers and hills, the railroad and telegraph were not lifelines, they were chains. The copper wires and iron tracks drew lines across their homelands, markers of a new order that didn't include them. Some tribes fought back, cutting telegraph lines, tearing up rails, trying to stall the steel tide. But the iron horse was relentless. Towns the rails bypassed withered into ghost stories. Others exploded into cities in a single summer. The wilderness shrank with every mile of track laid, every spike driven. The frontier was still fierce, but it was no longer alone. It was plugged in, connected, and sold by the mile. By the end of the 19th century, something fundamental had shifted. The line that once divided wilderness from settlement blurred, then vanished altogether. In 1890, the U.S. Census Bureau quietly declared, "There can hardly be said to be a frontier line. The American frontier, wild, raw, and unforgiving, was officially closed." The forests had been cleared. The buffalo, once thundering across the plains in endless herds, were nearly gone. The tribes who had lived on this land for millennia were confined to reservation pieces of earth carved away from the homes they had known. The land that was once boundless, measured only by how far a man could walk in a day, had been measured, mapped, and sold by the acre. For some, it was triumph. A nation stretched from ocean to ocean, a dream realized in steel and sweat. For others, especially native peoples, and those left out of the empire's embrace, it was silence, loss, and an echo of promises broken. But the end of the frontier wasn't just a line on a map, it was a shift in the heart of a nation. The frontier spirit, the stories of lone wanderers and ragged camps, didn't disappear. They became legend, wrapped in song and stitched into campfire tales. Frederick Jackson Turner argued that the frontier had carved the American soul itself, shaped a people who were restless, resourceful, and ready to gamble everything for a dream. The frontier gave birth to the log cabin president, the gold rush prospector, the cowboy whose shadow still rides the ridgeline at dusk. These became the country's myths-icons of independence and grit. But the truth was never that simple. The frontier was sweat and dust, hunger and heartbreak. It was a place of bright hopes and dark betrayals, a forge that shaped both triumph and tragedy. And today, that frontier spirit is still alive. The wagons are gone, replaced by highways that carve through what was once wild. The cabins are museums. The trails are ghost roads for curious travelers. But if you pause on a windswept prairie and listen, you can still hear it, the echo of wagon wheels, the murmur of ancient songs, the stories of those who dared to keep moving forward. The frontier never truly vanished. It became the foundation beneath our feet. It became the idea that pushing past the known, chasing the horizon, defines what it means to be American. Before there were pianos or flutes or brass horns, there was rhythm, the steady drumbeat of a foot on bare earth, the clap of hands in the hush of dusk, the low hum of a voice in the dark born from breath itself. Tens of thousands of years ago, long before cities rose and plows cut the soil, humans discovered something magic in sound. Around flickering fires, in deep forests and moonlit caves, they found that a stomp, a shout, or a whistle could stir a heart or calm a fear. Music, it turns out, isn't a human invention. It's a memory written into our very bones. Picture a circle of hunter-gatherers, huddled in the orange glow of embers. One starts to hum, low and steady. Another claps in rhythm. A third lifts their voice in a call that echoes the night birds. No words, just pure sound. In that moment, they're not just surviving. They're connected. They're human. Long before there were flutes of bone or drums of stretched skin, sound itself was sacred. Some believe music began as imitation mimicking the calls of animals or the cries of the wind to share a warning or a secret. But somewhere along the way, those sounds grew beyond survival. Rhythm became more than a signal. It became a language of feeling, a lullaby for the child in the cradle, a war song for the fighter in the night. There's even a theory that music came before language, or at least hand in hand with it, that before we spoke, we sang. And even today, infants respond more to melody than words. Something in the vibration of a song reaches deeper than reason, as if we're just remembering the first music we ever heard, the beat of a mother's heart. These earliest songs weren't for the rich or the few, they were for everyone. From the plains of Africa to the frozen forests of the north, wherever there were voices, there was music and ancient truth that carried across every border, every tongue. Stay with me, because we're about to follow that ancient rhythm as it echoes through time into the birth of instruments, the rise of song, and the power of music to connect hearts across the centuries. Follow or subscribe the channel if you haven't already, and let me know in the comments, do you feel the first music in the beat of your own heart? Because in the end, we didn't just create music, we remembered it. Before the first string was ever plucked, before a single drum head was stretched tight, humans already knew one thing. Sound had power, the power to move the soul, and that was only the beginning. Imagine it, the chill of Ice Age Europe, where mammoths still roamed the frost. Bitten plains and glaciers cut valleys through ancient stone. In that world of survival and silence, a quiet revolution was taking shape, not in the making of sharper blades or stronger shelters, but in the weaving of something deeper sound. Somewhere in a darkened cave, an early human took up a hollow bird bone, drilled a few careful holes into it, and raised it to their lips. A breath, a note clear, deliberate, haunting. This was no accident. This was the birth of the musical instrument. Archaeologists have unearthed these bone flutesome dating back over 40 years from places like the Whispering Halls Cave in what is now Germany. Carved from vulture wing bones or slabs of mammoth ivory, these instruments were no casual creation. Every finger hole was placed with precision, every groove worn by patient hands. This wasn't random, it was music, structured and intentional. A melody shaped from breath and bone. Why did they do it? Maybe the sounds mimicked the calls of birds, echoing nature's music. Maybe the flutes marked the turning of the seasons, the dance of life and death, or the hush of winter's breath. Or maybe, just maybe, someone made a flute for no other reason than to bring a flicker of beauty into the darkness. It's tempting to see these ancient makers as crude, driven only by the need to survive. But the flute tells a different story. It tells of creativity, of a mind that looked at a bone and saw not food or weapon, but possibility. It speaks of community, too. A flute played alone is a song, but a flute played beside another, woven with clapping hands or drumming feet, becomes a language shared, collective, alive. Picture those early gatherings, the flicker of a fire, voices rising and falling, flutes singing above the crackle of flames. The music would fill the cave, bounce off stone walls, turning a dark hollow into the first concert hall. And these bone flutes, these fragile artifacts of a world long gone, remind us that music came before the plow, the wheel, or the written word. In the grand story of human invention, Melody wasn't a luxury, it was a need. Those flutes didn't just survive the ice, they outlasted the centuries. They are whispers from the deep past, echoes that still find our ears and hearts today. From bone and breath, we made melody. From silence, we made song. If the flute was the first voice, the drum was our shared heartbeat. Long before kingdoms rose or cities cast their shadows, there were circles of people beneath the stars, hands clapping, feet stomping, sticks beating rhythm into the earth. The drum wasn't born in one place, it emerged everywhere, as if the human body itself was asking for a beat to match its own. The first drums were simple, animal skins stretched tight over hollow logs or clay pots. But even these humble creations carried a power greater than any blade. Drums were rhythm, yes, but they were also language, a way to call to others across valleys, or to mark the solemn pace of ritual. A mother might tap a rhythm to calm her child. A hunter might beat a drum to stir courage before the hunt. A shaman might pound out a rhythm to guide a spirit on its final journey. These first instruments didn't just accompany life, they shaped it. They turned breath and bone into art. They carried stories without words, speaking straight to the heart in a language as old as our own pulse. Stay with me, because the story doesn't end in that cave. The beat of the drum and the song of the flute echo forward into every melody, every symphony, every note we sing or play today. Follow or subscribe the channel if you haven't yet, and let me know in the comments. Do you think you'd have been the flute maker or the drummer by that fire? Because in the end, every song we know began with someone who dared to breathe music into the dark. A drum beat wasn't just noise, it was power. A single rhythm could summon a god, rally an army, or weave a village into one voice. From the first heartbeat of the earth, drums were never just instruments. They were signals, shared language in a world without words. In Africa, some of the oldest drumming traditions trace back tens of thousands of years. Here, drums became more than sound. They became speech, mimicking the tonal languages of the people, carrying news and songs across miles of savanna. In the cold forests of Siberia, shamans beat their drums in steady pulses to open the doors of the spirit world, journeying beyond this realm with each rhythm. And in the tangled green of the Amazon, the water drum echoed like thunder, a call that twisted through the jungle like a living force. What made the drum so essential wasn't just its thunder, it was that anyone could join. No melody was needed, no formal training, only the instinct to feel the beat, and feel it we did. Drums gave rhythm to every stage of life, birth, death, love, war. They turned chaos into order, binding families and tribes in one relentless pulse. We are one. Even in the first fields of the farmer, the drum had a roll sticks beat together to chase birds from the grain, to bless a harvest, to send prayers skyward in time with the seasons. Over centuries, drums became more than tools. They were art, etched and painted with patterns of faith, symbols of protection, of fertility, of connection to the divine. Drums spoke across language, across bloodlines, across the boundaries of earth and spirit. In a world without clocks or electricity, rhythm was how we counted, how we understood time itself. In the pounding of a drum, we didn't just hear sound, we felt meaning. We turned the heartbeat of the earth into a language of unity. As humans moved from camps to cities, from wandering to planting, music followed. It evolved from ritual to art, a journey that found its heart in ancient Mesopotamia. In the land where rivers carved kingdoms and clay tablets captured the first written words, music itself grew refined. Among the towering temples and ziggurats, musicians played the first harps and lyres, their images frozen in time on stone walls and clay tablets. These weren't the hollow bones of early flutes, they were crafted masterpieces, adorned in gold, silver, and lapis lazuli, their curves graceful, their voices soft and sweet. One of the most stunning finds comes from the city of where archaeologists uncovered the golden bull lyre, buried with a noblewoman whose bones still whispered of power. Its frame gleamed with gold, crowned with the head of a bull myth, and music twined together in wood and string. These harps didn't shout like a drum or wail like a flute. They whispered. They turned music into an intimate prayer, each note hanging in the air like a breath of incense. In these cities, music found a new home, not just to honor the gods, but to tell stories, to soothe, to inspire reflection. Musicians were trained, scales and intervals carefully noted in cuneiform on clay. Music was no longer only for survival, it was for beauty, for knowledge, for ceremony. In these cities of mud, brick, and mystery, music even reached for the stars. Scholars mapped constellations and matched them to harmonies, believing the heavens themselves sang in celestial intervals. And when the living passed on, the harps followed them, buried beside the dead, as if music could guide them to the next world. Unlike the raw power of the drum or the wild cry of the flute, the harp offered something new, a place for quiet, a place for the soul to pause and hear its own echo. With a single stretched string and a polished frame, the people of Mesopotamia gave voice to the silence that lived between each breath. And in that hush, the first melodies of civilization were born. Travel south to the green banks of the Nile, and you'll find music was more than an art, it was the language of the divine. The ancient Egyptians believed music was a gift from the gods themselves. They told of Bat, the cow-headed goddess of music, later merged into Hathor, who carried joy, fertility, and song in her gentle hands. Music wasn't just a pastomate, was woven into the very bones of life and death. Temples rang with the soft breath of flutes and the ripple of harps. In dusty markets, drums called feet to dance, laughter rising with every beat. Music flowed like the Nile, through palaces, homes, and tombs. It wasn't just a way to pass the time, it was a way to speak to eternity. Stay with me, because the story of music doesn't stop here. It travels through temples and battlefields, across oceans, and centuries, always finding new voices, new rhythms, new ways to shape the soul. Follow or subscribe the channel to keep the music alive, and let me know in the comments, which ancient song speaks to you most, the quiet melody of the harp or the thunder of the drum? Because in the end, music was never just sound, it was the first thing that made us human. Whether it was the hum of prehistoric flutes or the ceremonial harps of Mesopotamia, ancient Egypt took music and wove it into the very fabric of life. Music wasn't just an art, it was a heartbeat that pulsed through every ritual, every day, every breath. Workers sang to keep the rhythm as they stacked stones to the sky. Fishermen sang to the river, their voices skipping across the water like birds in flight. Priests lifted hymns in the echoing halls of temples, weaving prayer and song into a single breath. Even the most private moments, births and funerals, were wrapped in sound. Women played frame drums and rattles as life began and ended, each beat marking a passage from this world to the next. The instruments themselves became icons of this devotion. Harps, lutes, lyres, sistrums, flutes, each with a voice of its own. Over centuries, harps evolved from simple angular shapes to sweeping, elegant forms, their long, curved necks, symbols of status as much as song. Some harps boasted 22 strings, each one crafted with such care that their images still glow bright on the walls of ancient tombs 3,000 years later. The sistrum, a unique kind of rattle with metal rods that shivered and rang when shaken, held a sacred place in Egyptian life. It was linked to the worship of goddesses like Hathor and Isis. Its sound not meant to amuse, but to awaken the divine, to banish evil and shield the soul from the shadows of the underworld. Musicians in Egypt weren't just wandering minstrels. Many were priests and priestesses, serving the gods through music's language. Others graced the courts of pharaohs, weaving melodies to charm foreign dignitaries and flatter kings. In funerals, music took on a role as a bridge between this world and the next songs, to guide the soul on its last journey. Tombs of the wealthy even carried painted prayers and etched lyrics, as if to promise that death could never silence the music. To the ancient Egyptians, music was eternal. It honored the gods. It bound the people together. It echoed the cosmic order of Ma'at. The truth that music's rhythm wasn't chaos, it was the universe's heartbeat. In Egypt, to play music was to breathe the sacred. In the world of the ancient Greeks, music was more than a celebration. It was a science of the soul and of the cosmos itself. Where other cultures made music for ritual or revelry, the Greeks asked deeper questions. Why does sound reach into our hearts? What makes music move us? Their answers lay not just in poetry and myth, but in numbers. Pythagoras, the philosopher whose name we remember from geometry, was also a pioneer of music's mysteries. Legend says he once paused outside a blacksmith's forge and noticed that the hammers striking iron sang different notes depending on their weight. Intrigued, he turned to strings, discovering that when a string was divided in simple, perfect ratios, like 1/2 or 2/3, it produced sweet, harmonious tones. This simple revelation birthed the idea of the harmony of the spheres, the belief that the cosmos itself moved in silent music, every planet's path an echo of divine order. To the Greeks, every plucked string was a mirror of the heavens, a fleeting glimpse of perfect balance. Their instruments reflected this reverence. The lyre, a delicate harp-like instrument, became a symbol of civilization, carried by poets like Homer and Sappho, whose verses still ring down through the ages. In contrast, the aulos, a double reed pipe, added a wild edge cry that could stir battle, lust, or tragedy, filling Greek dramas and sacred rites alike. For the Greeks, music shaped not just the ear, but the soul. Plato himself argued that music could build the ideal citizen or undo them. Different modes, he believed, stirred different passions. Some inspired courage, others idleness or disarray. A song scale was as crucial as the laws of the city itself, a tool for crafting moral character and civic harmony. In this world, music wasn't mere amusement. It was healing. It was law. It was math, turned to melody and rhythm. The Greeks laid the first stones of music theory, intervals, scales, the deep truths of harmony. Their discoveries would echo for centuries across empires, across ages, whispering that every note we play today is a ripple from that first ancient breath. Stay with me, because from the quiet math of Pythagoras to the roar of festival drums, music has always been more than entertainment. It's been the measure of who we are and who we dream to become. Follow or subscribe the channel to keep this ancient melody alive. And tell me in the comments, would you rather play a sistrum in the temple or a lyre by the fireside? Because music was never just notes, it was the first voice of humanity. In Greece, music was no longer just sound, it became a bridge between reason and wonder, where numbers and beauty could dance together, where the soul could calculate and soar at once. But if the Greeks gave music its philosophy, it was Rome that gave it volume. In the Roman world, music was about power, about function and form, about spectacle and control. It was the pulse of the empire. In Roman life, music thundered through festivals and echoed in sacred ceremonies. It blared in the arenas as gladiators prepared for combat, and most strikingly, it led armies into battle. The Greeks saw music as a path to the divine. The Romans saw it as a tool of discipline, a weapon of empire. One of their most fearsome instruments was the cornu, a massive brass horn curved like a giant G, often taller than the soldier carrying it. Its blast wasn't for melody, it was a command. It cut through the chaos of battle, signaling troops to advance, to fall back, to stand fast. Alongside it was the tuba, not the modern brass tuba we know, but a straight, piercing trumpet that carried orders across the roar of clashing swords. These horns weren't just instruments, they were the empire's voice. Tens of thousands of soldiers moved in perfect time, following the call of brass through the dust of conquest. It was music as psychological warfare order born from noise, empire sculpted in sound. But Roman music wasn't only forged in battle. In temples, tibia-double pipes gave breath to the gods' rituals. In arenas, music opened the games like an ancient anthem before the clash of steel and blood. At lavish banquets, harps and the haunting notes of the hydraulicin, early water-powered organ, created an atmosphere of luxury, each note a shimmering thread in the empire's tapestry. Rome borrowed heavily from Greece, but remade everything in its own image. Where the Greeks prized individual expression, Rome demanded public spectacle. Music was performance, propaganda, a roar that echoed from the heart of the city to the farthest outposts of empire. And when Rome's legions marched into Egypt, Judea, and Gaul, they carried home new sounds, African beats, Eastern melodies, Mediterranean rhythms. Roman music became a mosaic, each note a testament to the empire's hunger. Yet, unlike the Greeks, Roman philosophers wrote little of music's theory. They didn't ponder its mysteries, they used it, wielded it, let it ring from the stones of their cities. In the end, Rome didn't refine music, it amplified it, until even the edges of empire thrummed to the beat of its brass and drums. While the West marched to Rome's brassy rhythms, the East explored a different music, the soul of sound itself. In ancient India, music was not a performance, it was a path. Rooted in the Vedas, the oldest sacred texts of the region, Indian music began as chant. The Samaveda in particular was sung, its hymns woven into precise, elaborate patterns called samanad, merely to entertain, but to harmonize the soul with the universe. As Indian civilization grew, so did its instruments. The veena, an ancient stringed instrument, became linked to Saraswati, goddess of wisdom and art. The deep, resonant miridangam drum kept time in sacred performances. Every note was guided by ragas and talas, melodic and rhythmic frameworks that could summon the spirit of dawn or the calm of midnight. Indian music wasn't amusement, it was discipline, meditation, a way to balance the energies of the heart and reach beyond the mortal. Meanwhile, in ancient China, music was as sacred as it was political. The mythical emperor Shun was said to have ruled not just with laws, but with music, harmonizing the empire like a great orchestra. Confucian philosophy taught that proper music led to moral order, that the right tones could soothe rebellion or inspire virtue. Chinese instruments were shaped by this belief in balance. The guqin, a 7-string zither, was played by scholars in quiet reflection, its gentle notes a mirror of introspection. The sheng, a mouth-blown reed instrument, wove many voices into one, symbolizing unity. The bianzhong of bronze, bells sounded in the courts, each peal a statement of hierarchy and order. Music was tuned to the cycles of nature, aligning the soul of the listener with the pulse of the cosmos. In both India and China, music was not a luxury or an escape, it was life itself. It was a mirror of the stars, a code for the soul, a bridge to the eternal. And so, from the hollow bone flutes of the Ice Age to the shimmering strings of Mesopotamia, from Egyptian rattles that woke gods to Chinese zithers that calmed emperors, music has always been more than just entertainment. It is the oldest language of the heart born before empire, echoing long after empires fade. Why has music endured when so many other inventions have crumbled into dust? Because music speaks to something wordless in us all. It comforts, it warns, it excites and unites. It's the lullaby that calms a crying child, the funeral drum that echoes when grief has no words, the anthem that stirs before battle or game. Music knows no borders. A melody from the Andes can move a soul in Africa. A beat from a Polynesian island can stir memories in a frozen northern land. It's not the notes we recognize, it's the feeling they carry. And music is as resilient as the human heart. It adapts. It survives conquest, migration, war, and revolution. Instruments cross oceans. Songs change tongues. Scales evolve. But always, the beat remains. The note, the breath, the longing to connect. Across the ages, we've used music to forge identity. Tribes, nations, revolutions have all had their songs. But more than that, music has been our way to step beyond identity, to find common ground in the quiet hum of a shared heartbeat. Stay with me, because the story of music is still being written, every new song, every new voice carrying forward this ancient, eternal flame. Follow or subscribe to the channel if you haven't yet, and let me know in the comments, what song stirs the deepest part of your soul? Because in the end, music doesn't just fill the silence, it reminds us who we are and who we hope to be. Music doesn't need a common language, it only asks for an ear that listens and a heart that feels. Across the ages and across every border, it speaks in tones and rhythms that reach beyond words. Modern science now proves what ancient sages seemed to know. Music doesn't just echo in the air, it echoes in the brain, the body, the very pulse of who we are. Studies show how music alters brain waves, calming the restless, softening stress, and bringing light to places where even memory can fade. Alzheimer's patients, when words have become ghosts, still remember songs. In the simple strains of a melody, whole lifetimes flicker back to life. Soldiers burdened by scars of battle find a moment of peace in the familiar beat of a drum or the hush of a gentle chord. Babies, long before they can shape a word, find comfort in the lullabies whispered by their mothers, melodies that cradle them into dreams. We've woven music into every corner of our lives. We've turned it into a kind of therapy, a balm for wounds seen and unseen. We've used it as protest, as a cry for justice, a rallying cry that breaks through walls of indifference. We've raised it in worship, in temples and cathedrals, and under open skies, as an offering to whatever power might be listening. We've made it into business, sold it, shared it, streamed it, and turned it into an industry that wraps the globe in invisible waves of song. In a world fractured by words and beliefs, music is the thread that binds. It doesn't care if we share a mother tongue. It doesn't need our histories to align. It only needs the soft drum of a heartbeat, the shiver of breath, the silent vow that says, I am listening. Stay with me, because the next chapter will look deeper into how music continues to unite us even when everything else pushes us apart. Follow or subscribe the channel if you haven't yet, and let me know in the comments, what song brings you home when the world feels far away? Because music isn't just a sound, it's a lifeline in the noise. Across language and landscape, music remains one of the rare constants or human signature, stretching back to the first breath of song. From the earliest echoes of bone flutes in frozen caves to the pulse of drumbeats against ancient stone, music is the thread that binds our past to our present. No matter how far we reach into the logic of AI, the vastness of space, the cold brilliance of technology, music brings us home. It reminds us that we are not just wires and gears, not just ideas and algorithms. We are feeling, thinking, dreaming creatures, flesh and breath, spirit and skin. As long as there is life, there will be music, because before we ever carved our stories into stone, before we ever shaped words into language, we had sound. And sound, pure, trembling, alive, made us human. Follow or subscribe the channel if you haven't yet, and let me know in the comments, what note, what song, what sound keeps your soul awake in the quiet? Because music isn't just history, it's the first spark that set our voices alight,